Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hello, lovely radicals. What's up on your side of the world? I hope your skies have seen some sun lately, literally and metaphorically speaking. Since over here in chilly, drizzly, grey Switzerland, I'm considering to move my heater back into my living room. Seriously, all. I've got cold feet, man. No, really. I mean, it's been yucky weather-wise over here, so a little complaining. And as for the metaphorical side of things, yes, of course, I do hope you all had some sun in the sky. You know, recently I've noticed that it's been a while since I've had one of those real belly laughs, the ones where you hope that your undies stay dry. You know which ones? Yeah, I kind of miss them. What about your vocal cords? Experienced some helpless laughter lately? I hope so, because is there anything better? It's strange when I think back of, let's call them the before completely body-obsessed days. There sure as hell was more laughter in my life. I mean, I used to laugh so hard that I spilled my own glasses with tears of laughter. And I had to clean my glasses after laughing. And I remember, cringeworthy as it was, the moment I burst out laughing in the middle of a news segment because I couldn't stop thinking about something funny, and I was willing myself so hard to stop laughing that in the end I sounded like a donkey on steroids and we had to interrupt the whole segment. It was terrible. My boss wasn't happy and I couldn't do anything. And it happens to almost every radio host once in their career, and it's a great memory anyway. But I also had a friend that unfortunately moved to another country with his wife. And back when we hung out, we used to watch a lot of stand-up comedy together and slam poetry. And I swear, even when we went grocery shopping or going for coffee, we used to be so silly, and there were moments when we suddenly cracked up over something and ended up almost peeing our pants because we basically thought we were the funniest people on the planet. And those laugh attacks were just unforgettable. Somehow the best medicine when you think about it, right? And you just cannot force it. It happens or it doesn't. And yeah, so I've noticed that I've not had one of those laugh attacks in a long time. And what my analytical brain came up with was the less I allow my more difficult feelings to come up, the less I have those real healing laughs. I mean, it's not rocket science really, but yeah, that's what my brain came up with. So let me say, I sincerely hope your eyes had some reasons to smile, or at least they were allowed to shed some healing tears. Sun and rain really make nature work. If we would rule out rain, our earth would shrivel up and die. And if there was only rain, then the earth would eventually drown and die. So the more feelings we allow ourselves to feel, the more freely the spectrum of human emotions that we all have, the more they are unrepressed and processed, the better our human psyche works. Again, not rocket science, but man, I know it sounds so easy, and we are all so great at dishing out advice, but we're all equally great at running from those feelings that we find difficult. So please don't think because I can formulate these psychological mechanisms so well that I'm better than anyone else. I'm just as you, a human being. I struggle, I worry, I over-worry, I beat myself up for struggling, and then I beat myself up for beating myself up for struggling. And then I remind myself again to upgrade my thinking. Again and again and again. So for me and for all of us, I wish we can allow ourselves to be more and more connected to the here and now and not get lost in our head every waking minute. Because in the here and now, there is no future to worry about. Because when you're really in the here and now, really living it now without going into your head, there is no future to worry about and no past to drag us down. What's in the here and now is usually much more bearable than the actual scenarios that we are constantly playing in our heads. We kind of make up horrors all the time that hardly ever end up happening. You know what I mean? In our heads. As if life wasn't hard enough already with the shit that does happen, we tend to make up more and more stuff in our head all the time. So we make it even harder for ourselves. You know, all those what would happen ifs, the I think I shouldn't have's, the why didn't I do that, and the if only that person hadn't. Those really piss on our actual parade that is here and now. So I want to remind you and myself that I wish for all of us that we can stop to really feel the wind in our hair, the sun on our skin, and the ground beneath our feet. There's something to be said about the now that we so often miss out because we're caught up in our head. So for me, the past week was interesting. There have been the usual turbulences, some more pleasant than others, of course. And I tried to take them in a little more consciously. And what has made my own personal sun come out, for example, is the fact that I have finally mustered up the courage to take drum lessons. Drum lessons, and that I freaking love drumming. Even as a total greenhorn, I'm positive to say that drumming, as probably nothing else before that, gets me out of my head at lightning speed. It's just me and the sticks and the awkward drumming that I do as the beginner that I am, and me trying to get into some rhythm, awkwardness and all. It's freaking awesome. And again, I realized, I had been dreaming of being a drummer ever since I was a kid. And what was it that held me back? My thoughts that I would make a complete fool of myself, my thoughts about how ridiculous I would look behind a drum kit, my thoughts about being laughed at by a teacher, my thoughts about surely sucking at drumming, my thoughts about surely not getting it right, my thoughts about not being a talent, my thoughts that actual drummers were way cooler than me, and on and on and on. And now I'm 43 and I'm wondering, why the hell didn't I take drum lessons before? So if there was ever something you wanted to do but felt too self-conscious to actually do it, please go out and try and do it. Because, I look ridiculous behind this drum kit. But I loved it. I loved the feeling of it. I didn't even think about it. And this teacher was great. He didn't ever give me a feeling of being ridiculous. So I just played like a kid. I really played like a kid and I loved it. And since I cannot afford drum lessons, on a regular basis, I just got a pair of sticks and I sure have some pillows here at home. So for sure, I'm going to just drum on those pillows and just learn some rhythms and hopefully have some fun with it. I'll tell you how this goes in a few weeks, but I really, really loved it. And I was amazed at how quickly we can get out of our heads if we do something that really lights us up. And for me, that was drumming, and it was an amazing experience. I wanted to share that. So that was the sun in my sky moment. And I've also had a little success in the way of working towards more laughter, because I allowed my eyes to cry when there was a moment of unexpected vulnerability. And it was pretty impressionable. It was a few days ago when my friend, another one who's moved to another city, but at least stayed in Switzerland, when she came for a visit and we had one of our epic evenings together, sitting in my living room, having the kind of conversations that leave you feeling full and nourished and grateful, those really deep soul-searching talks that way too few people are willing to engage in. And suddenly I felt this deep love for her. It was a weird mixture of sweetness and spaciousness in my heart. And there was this taste of sadness in it too. a bittersweet rush of appreciation for her, mixed with fear of losing her, mixed with the worry that something could happen to her, with a deep soul gratitude, though, about this soul connection that we have, even though we only see each other every other month or so. And this whole mixture of feeling came so sudden, and it confronted me head on with my vulnerable part, the part that loves, the part that takes risks, the part that is not so self-sufficient as I always think I should be, the part that is soft, the part that needs connection. And when we shared this moment together, I just started crying, which was a surprise given that I'm usually not that openly marshmallowy. And it was a wonderful moment. My vulnerable side, as much as I sometimes try to push it away because it somehow hurts, right? And I don't want to be hurt, that side also feels the most alive, the most in the moment, the most connected to life. And with it, to all its unpredictable sides, of course, and the possibility of loss. And it really was a memorable moment. It was so full and so rich, and it became so clear that it was that I'm actually craving. But it also, of course, puts me at risk of losing and of being hurt. And that's probably the core of what we're all struggling with. You know, our hunger for connection and our fear of losing those connections. So there's no real reason for me telling you this other than the paradox that by feeling what we are afraid of, we are actually living and connecting. And to you, radicals, I want to say thank you for connecting to me, to this mission, to this discovery journey we're on together. I've received some of the most heartwarming reviews and 5-star ratings on iTunes that really made me realize how much we can move when we open up to one another. And as hard as it is, that it's also incredibly powerful to unlearn some of those old narratives we believed to be true for so long. That we need to look a certain way to be loved, that our bodies and food and exercise routines are measurements for our moral value, that our life's goal is to perform happiness and perfection for other people, when really all of that leads to lives not really lived. I think it's great that we're learning to reconnect to the values that are in us, that our culture, our upbringing, the messages we internalized have made us forget. We can do it, one step at a time, radicals. And also I want to give a triple gratitude shout out to Vanessa and Mira for becoming patrons of this show. As you know, my goal is to make this a fully listener-funded endeavor so that I can produce it without losing sleep over it. And Vanessa and Mira have just joined the greats of my crew on patreon.com. And for all those who think this podcast is worthy of support, go check out my page on this platform called Patreon. You can find my site at patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. That's patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. Your pledge helps me continue, and I'm intensely grateful for your contributions. And as you know, you can cancel your pledge anytime, no strings attached. And again, thank you, Mira. Thank you, Vanessa. You're the best. And here's my thank you for all of you in form of another great conversation that I'd like to share with you. This week on the Life Unrestricted podcast, we all have a chance to meet Dr. Stacey Rosenfeld from Coral Gables, Florida. Stacey is a clinical psychologist specializing in eating disorders and body image concerns. She also works with substance misuse, anxiety, and mood disorders, infertility and relationship difficulties. And as a group psychotherapist and certified eating disorder specialist, Dr. Rosenfeld has worked at various treatment centers and universities, and she now directs Gatewell Therapy Center in Miami, Florida. This is what she said when I asked her about her memories of how being in a body felt like as a kid.
Wow, that's a big question. I think when I go back young, I have very positive memories of my body. I think I was lucky. I have associations of being active and outside and not really thinking of my body, which I think is a goal, especially for children and, often for adult women, to just like not have it be something on your radar. So I can think back to pretty early on and not having my body really be a thing. And that contrasts to some of the women that I work with who tell me that, it was always a thing. So I feel lucky in that sense. I have a couple of theories about why that might be. I also talk in my book about a memory from maybe age 10-ish, when I was on my way to gymnastics practice with a friend. And I happened to notice, we were in the back seat of the car, the seatbelts lying across our bellies. And I happened to notice that her seatbelt was lying flatter across her stomach. And it was, it started as an observation, but within a second, sort of judgment crept in. And I, had this idea like, well, that's, the way that her seatbelt is, like, that's a better scenario than the way that my seatbelt is, and where there was a little bit of a rise there.
Do you remember what got it into your head that seatbelt scenario over there was better than yours?
I don't know. I guess, like by age 10, I was indoctrinated to diet culture. I think that by age 10, we take on so much of the culture. Like I said, I feel like I was lucky to have escaped it before that time. But I'm sure that at that point, whether it was commercials, advertisements, hearing other people talk at school or family members or anyone, I was aware that thinner was better.
Yeah, we soak it up as kids, whether we want to or not, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I've read research that shows that kids as early as 3 years old have this understanding that it's, quote unquote, better to be thin.
Mm-hmm. For some people, it goes back to their earliest memories in, let's say, the pediatrician's office. For me, certainly it did. When he says, some derogatory comment like, are you letting her eat too much? Or she's certainly too heavy for her height or her age. And you have a dieting mother already, and then you're basically screwed, because then that's the end of your childhood as you've known it before.
Yeah, it sets the stage for so many issues later on.
Yes, completely. And at the beginning of your book, you say that in all of your many years of clinical training and practice as a psychologist, you've come across thousands of women struck by some sort of eating disorder bug. Let's say, be it restricting, binging, over-exercising, pathologically dieting, or abusing laxative, I read, or purging. Generally, women who approach their body and psyche with self-reproach and, as I know it from myself, with a certain amount of disgust also. And the surprise being that it wasn't just women who were officially diagnosed with an eating disorder. So can you describe for us what your findings were?
Right. So, obviously my clinical work informs my writing and my thinking, but the book ended up taking on like a sort of journalistic or anthropological bent to it, where, I kind of started looking at the culture and observing society as a whole and thinking about how do we talk about things? How do we present images in the media? All that kind of stuff. And obviously, many of the people who come into my office to see me have clinical eating disorders. They have diagnoses. But when we think about eating disorders and eating issues as a whole, many of us in the field think of them as spectrum disturbances. So you go on the one end of the spectrum from people who have like what we would call a normal relationship with food, where it's just not so much an issue. You don't think about food so much. You don't think about your body so much. And then moving along that spectrum more and more toward disorder, we have like the chronic dieters and then the more disordered eaters, and then eventually getting to the other end of the spectrum of the folks with eating disorders. So I really, in the book, focus on that spectrum piece. And in my mind, there isn't that much of a distinction. I mean, obviously, someone who meets full criteria for anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder, where life is significantly impacted by the symptoms, that's a serious concern. But we have other eating disorders. We have other specified feeding and eating disorder where it's sort of, you're maybe not meeting full criteria for those disorders, but it's still clinically significant. And I started to think, well, what's the difference between that and disordered eating? Mm-hmm. And what's the difference between disordered eating and someone who's chronically dieting or, weight cycling? And to me, some of those distinctions might be a little bit more subtle than we originally thought.
Is it the compulsiveness of the thoughts or the behaviors that distinguishes them?
For the clinical diagnoses, like I said, it really comes down to how much do these symptoms impact your life, And again, that exists on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of people walking around the world who are disordered eaters and think about food and their bodies in a very destructive way, but they still can hold a job, can have relationships, that kind of thing. And then, when you get to more of the clinical manifestations, we see more impairment in kind of daily living. But still, even with some of the clinical disorders, people can function, A lot of times it's almost upsetting to think about like, wow, first of all, I hate the phrase, you don't look like you have an eating disorder.
Yeah, that's terrible.
But, just weight aside, people who appear to be functioning well, they have a job or are in school or have decent relationships and seem to have like a relatively full life, could be living in an internal hell. So,
some are mothers.
It's really, and it's like that discrepancy between what it feels like to be so imprisoned, but sort of still functioning in the world. I think that's really hard for those who are in that place.
Of course.
Anyway, to come back to your question, one of the things that I thought was interesting, just sort of in my years of practice, was when I would see someone with an eating disorder, oftentimes I would say to them, who in your life eats normally? Looking for kind of role models for normal eating or healthy body image. And a lot of times the answer to that question is no one. So even though the constellation of people in these women's lives, they're not all eating disordered, it's just interesting to me that they can't even identify someone in their lives as a role model for these things.
Who's relaxed around food and body.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's some thoughts I have about, people with disordered eating are oftentimes, and I include myself, I didn't realize what was going on. I mean, there's different levels to which we could unpack this. When we hear about eating disorders, I can only speak for myself. I thought, well, that's not me. And people with disordered eating, often they would deny this to their bones, saying, no, I'm just eating healthy. What are you going on about? They would deny that they have disordered eating going on. I mean, the internet is full of them, even telling us we should follow their example.
Yeah, well, that's what we should be doing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like I said before, the quote that's very destructive, you don't look like you have an eating disorder. A lot of people that come to see me, it's really sad, meet criteria for a clinical eating disorder and don't even know that they have one.
Can you make an example?
Yeah, someone who comes in and says, well, who would meet criteria for anorexia or at least for a subthreshold eating disorder, but says I eat. And I'll have to say, well, of course you eat. If you didn't eat at all, you wouldn't be here. They don't sort of realize that people with anorexia do eat, or they feel like they're not low weight enough to have an eating disorder.
Exactly.
I get that a lot. Or I don't need to be hospitalized, so therefore this isn't that serious, which is really untrue in many cases.
Why is there such a misperception about eating disorders? Because it's only depicted in the news, the skeletal type people? Because the majority of eating disorders are not visible.
Yeah, many people with eating disorders, men, women, people of color, people of different sizes. I mean, there's a lot of variety in terms of presentation. And yet it's interesting because every time I'm interviewed for an article on eating disorders, the stock image that gets pulled is a white, underweight woman.
Young woman on top of that.
Young woman, absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. So I feel like there's a lot of work to do in terms of how we're representing this illness and making it a more accurate representation.
Yes, I think so too, because no wonder so many people say I'm not sick enough. I said I'm not sick enough for a long time. And even before that, I had been doing what I had been doing forever. So there was no knowledge, no nothing. I was not represented. On top of that, I'm 44 this year. I'm not represented in any sort of depiction of eating disorders. So, of course, there are so many women nowadays thinking, well, I'm over 30 or 40. I can't have an eating disorder. This is something, I'm just keeping my weight in check by some crazy means. And I think this conversation needs to change because I think the way diet culture has us in its grip is leading to more and more women in midlife and beyond having eating disorders.
Right.
Disordered eating.
I agree. And the reality is it's not like if you develop disordered eating, it doesn't just magically go away when you turn 30 or 40. I've actually had patients who have said that to me, like, oh, I just think that once I get older, maybe when I have a family, like this will just subside. And that's certainly not the case. And it really is, as you're saying, an uphill battle, this kind of like swimming upstream thing in terms of the diet culture. I talk about it as recovery against a backdrop of disorder. Right. How do you recover when our culture is essentially telling you not to?
Exactly. Julie Duffy Dillon said the world has an eating disorder, or it's starting to look like that.
Yeah, that was the whole point of my book is that,
the title
it's so normative to be disordered. And I think that really answers your question is that it's hard to see it. 2 points. Number one, when you see people who, if you're a disordered eater and you see people who have clinical eating disorders, you might think to yourself, well, I'm not that bad.
Right.
Which might be true, but I also think it underestimates just everything that you're experiencing as an individual and how destructive the processes are for you.
Can you be a little more specific?
Yeah. Okay. Let me just finish the other point. And then I also think that when you're surrounded by everyone else who's doing the same thing, it feels like there's nothing wrong with me because everyone's doing it, know? The destructive processes. Gosh, I mean, I know so many people who are obsessive around food, so rigid, counting calories. It's interesting because I have young children. I'm now seeing it play out in parenting and motherhood. All these Facebook groups of moms about here's a paleo muffin recipe for toddlers. Here's a first birthday cake. And I looked at the ingredients of the cake and it was like there was nothing cake-like about it.
Yeah, right. Let's make a cake that doesn't taste like cake.
That doesn't taste like cake. And I think this is just going to get passed along to the next generation. Also, just the body attack, I don't even think cover it. But body attack, how that plays out in terms of not honoring hunger, how it plays out in terms of compulsive exercise, and in other ways too.
And how would you tell someone who is experiencing this but thinks that that's a healthy way of living and that they just live with that? What would you tell a woman like that? Would you even try and wake her up to what she's doing? Or would you not get through to her because she's convinced that she's doing what she needs to do to belong to the Fit Moms Club or whatever it is?
I mean, I always try. It's worth trying.
Yeah.
If someone is, I talked about like the internal struggle. Being a disordered eater can be torture. And so I think that if you can get someone to realize, on the one hand, everyone's doing this, and I understand that we live in a world that values thin above a lot of other things. On the other hand, you're tortured. So sort of presenting that dilemma for someone without necessarily like forcing action or change, but continuing to weigh, what does it mean to you to want to continue in this way? What would it be like to be a little more free around this?
Yeah, but they would probably tell you, well, if I don't do this, I will gain weight. And this is like the sort of Damocles that is hanging over my head. And then you would start and see their pain.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of them, it comes down to, I have these conversations a lot of the day, most weeks. And a lot of them, it comes down to, yes, I would be afraid that I would gain weight. And then again, on the flip side, I imagine I might feel so free, so liberated, happier, more content. And it's continuing to explore those different outcomes, not in a pushy way. I work with people using something called motivational interviewing, where you're sort of like gently guiding someone toward something, but like having them figure it out on their own.
Can you try this with me so that people have an example how motivational interviewing works?
A decisional balance is basically like looking at the pros and cons of something. So like you're disordered eating. What are you getting out of it? Like, what does it do for you? Everything has a benefit that we do. People might say,
keeps me safe from being body shamed.
Yeah. And we don't want to minimize that, because that's a big thing in this world, and it's a big thing for you. And then the flip side, what are the negative consequences of that?
All right. So that you have to kind of list the price. What are you willing to do to keep this perceived safety up?
Right. And then exploring each of those in depth, continuing to come back to that. And I'm not saying to someone, oh, you need to just get rid of that, like get over that. That never works. But it helps for someone on her own to make some connections, and eventually get to the point where she says to me, like, I don't want to live this way. Someone said to me maybe 6 months ago in my office, like, the whole diet thing, like, that's just done. I'm not doing that anymore. Like, that ship has sailed. And I thought, like, wow, like she just got to a point where she wasn't going to do it anymore, even if it meant gaining some weight.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And just as a basic point, it's probably a moot point to talk about that with you, but still, I think there are so many people that are in therapy for something or other, because we all have issues. We are all recovering from something. So,
sure.
But a lot of times, and I talk to so many people, and in real life as well, and people come to me and write to me, and most people tell me that their therapist doesn't even ask about their eating or their body issues or their food issues unless someone is anorexic or anorexic looking, mind you. And so it doesn't even get addressed.
Yeah.
Some woman recently told me that she thought she had her bulimia under control, and then her drinking started flaring up, and then she went to therapy for drinking, and then, there was an addiction transfer going on all the time, but she kind of kept one thing hidden. And women, a lot of times, the eating thing is the last one they want to address, and oftentimes therapists do not ask.
Right.
Why?
Right. Why?
We should make this, the number one question when some trust is established, that we should be able to ask people about how they relate to food in their body, because there lies so much in there to unpack.
Right, right. My one thought is that working with eating issues is a specialized track in therapy, and it could be that people don't feel comfortable in that domain, and so just don't go there. There are a lot of therapists who just don't work with eating issues, and so might not see that as something to broach or something that might be significant, or might not like want to open Pandora's box.
I think it's that one. I mean, I hate to think that therapists are not in the knowledge of people having eating issues without it being shockingly obvious to the eye. But no, I mean, I was in therapy After 23, I went to therapy, and I've been in therapy ever since because I've a lot of trauma to work on, and I've switched therapists. And only in the past 2 years has this been a topic. And we've addressed my, the attachment trauma, the abuse, the violence, the addiction in the family, the this and that, everything, but never that I had an eating disorder, and I didn't even think so because I was just trying to keep my weight down to stay safe in this world, I say in quotes. And so it was never addressed, which makes me think how much time is lost there because, it just goes unnoticed and it's not even addressed. But it plays into everything.
It does. Sorry, I'm just struck by that was such like a impactful way of saying that. Keep my weight down to stay safe in this world.
That's how I perceive it. It's a safety mechanism, which I'm sure we can unpack some of that because it'll probably branch out into 10,000 things that somehow are connected. And for me, it was a means of stopping the ridicule, feeling like I don't belong, or trying to stop that feeling of being the odd one out, not accepted, not like the other kids, not having a safe home, somehow thinking I need to fix something. And the one thing that came to mind was my body because I was ridiculed for that as well. So it was the way for me to not, attract any harm, and it worked. So of course I held on to that for dear life, and as we know, diets don't work, so maintenance got harder over the years, and I was just unknowingly I was willing to pay that price. So more exercise, okay, less of the foods, okay, more restrictions here, okay, less social gatherings there, and I was just willing to do it, and I never saw the big picture. Like where am I in this picture? There's no breathing room here anymore.
What was your aha moment, if it's okay to ask?
Yes, it was. I was in denial about, exercise being problematic and and I didn't really address it, but I had lost my period already, so I wasn't really sure, and I didn't mind even that.
Yeah.
And then I got Ritalin for my ADHD. That was, 2013 or 12, I don't know. And then suddenly my weight started dropping even more. I went from a normal weight. No one would have noticed that I was highly disordered already for years and decades. And after that, my weight dropped so fast. I didn't eat differently. I didn't exercise even more, nothing. I just, bam. And then that got me psychologically hooked on Ritalin, even though it didn't help me for my ADHD, obviously. And I now know what it is, and that it is speed, and that we do actually describe this to children, which makes my hair stand out at the back of my neck. But certainly for a long time, I was like, that's the silver bullet. Maybe I can ease up on my other behaviors a little bit thanks to this Ritalin. But I got sicker and sicker because my body is not built for that. And people started noticing, wow, she's getting mighty thin. Still not anorexically, the typical depiction of, but very thin for me. And I was getting weaker and weaker. And my hair was really frizzy, straw-like, and my skin was like parched, and sitting down hurt me, and everything was getting worse.
Yeah.
And so it took me a really long time actually for my back to give out, and I had to have spinal fusion at the turn of 2015 and 16. And I realized, am I really willing to risk my liver for, keeping the Ritalin consumption up, which was officially prescribed to me, and on top of that, pain medications and a surgery. And at that point, I was like, no, I'm not willing to do that. And I gave up Ritalin, and the weight came back. So I'm back to where I was before the dip happened.
Yeah.
But with much more knowledge, and seeing that all of my symptoms, including the loss of period, was all related to exercise and me suppressing my weight as I had been doing for so long. And I started connecting the dots, and I couldn't help thinking about how many people are taking some sort of medication or other to help speed things up a bit? Pun intended or not intended.
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking, and then I started researching stuff, and it was how do you say that? I don't know the English expression, but it was like, oh my God, I show all the symptoms of exercise bulimia. And I show symptoms of anorexia, not visibly, but by loss of period and the restrictive eating. And I have total binge episodes. So it was confusing, but I saw I do have a problem.
Yeah.
And then I started addressing it. And I don't know, the one talent that I have is talking about stuff that really bothers me. And it started bothering me so much. And I started seeing it everywhere that I thought, I'm done. I need to talk about this because people are suffering from that and trying to not let anyone know about it.
Right.
So now you got my whole story.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, that's so common. So I have these two specialties, eating issues and alcohol and drug issues. And there's such an overlap.
Yes.
And we could talk about like different reasons or theories why that is. But, you know, people using substances, particularly speed, amphetamines, that kind of thing, in the service of their eating disorder.
Yeah, it came to me totally by coincidence,
you know?
Because I was like, okay, maybe something helps to keep my racing thoughts in some order. And then instead, what happened is my primary goal started happening. I just lost weight. And then, you know, I thought, wow, Ritalin is being prescribed so easily nowadays.
Yeah.
Basically, I was with the one super specialist in this country that she is known for being the best researcher on ADHD. She personally prescribed this medication to me. And I still don't really know what to think about that because I can only guess how many people get a prescription by saying, you know, I can't get my thoughts straight and I'm easily distracted and my kid is getting on my nerves. And then they're like, yeah, here you go. Big Pharma thanks you for this.
Right.
And it was basically the perfect storm waiting to happen. So I'm like, we need to do something about this.
Right. I think that ADHD meds can be overprescribed. When we're talking about this overlap, you know, it's hard to know. I mean, I think that people do have independent attentional issues, but when we're talking about eating issues and attentional issues, it's hard to know what's what. I mean, if you're not eating enough, it's really hard to focus. You know what I mean? And I've seen that. It's always quite interesting to me that when I work with someone who's malnourished, like one of the hallmark signs for me is missing appointments. Like, oh, I thought our appointment was Thursday. It's actually Tuesday. Like a lot of attentional focus, things like that, that when the body starts to get nourished again, that dissipates.
I never had those signs anyway. I was so reliable all the time, and it wasn't that. It's probably just that I had exercise bulimia and I was jumpy and obsessive about, you know, it took up so much space in my head, my body. How can I keep this up?
So you didn't have room for anything else, maybe.
Probably that somehow translated into ADHD symptoms. And the icon in this field, in this country, was sure that it was ADHD. And I'm beginning to think it really wasn't. And I'm beginning to think that many, many, many cases of, you know, ADHD aren't really. What if they are a deficiency in emotional nurture? Or
you know, another big one is anxiety. I mean, anxiety looks a lot like ADHD.
Oh, yes.
And then there's a huge correlation between anxiety and eating issues. So it's really hard to know what's what, you know. I don't know how often, like you said, people go into a psychiatrist's office and they say, I have problems with focus. They, you know, the psychiatrist asks them 10 questions. Do you ever forget things? Do you ever, you know, leave your keys at home? Which, you know, like I think all of us do, right? And if they're not ruling out an anxiety disorder, I think it's really hard to move forward with something purely attentional.
Yeah, totally. I really like that you do specialize in eating disorders and addictions and anxiety and mood disorders and relationship issues, as I read. And I really can't help but think that all of these are much more closely related than one might commonly think. As I said before, I think this, I mean, I want to pick your brain on this. So let's begin with eating disorders and alcohol or substance misuse. How do you find these are related?
So there are pretty significant correlations between these disorders. I'd say like a conservative estimate is that 30% of patients with eating disorders will also have an alcohol or drug problem. Some research even suggests higher. Of the 3 clinical eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating, the highest correlation with substance use disorders seems to be bulimia. And we could probably like have a whole another conversation about why that might be.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
First of all, with anorexia, I've worked with a number of patients with alcohol, for instance, who will limit their alcohol use based on, calories. Yeah. I've worked also with patients who will drink and then use that as a substitution for food. So I feel like it could go both ways, you know?
Yeah.
I think that many patients I see will drink to either allow themselves to eat because, they become a little disinhibited and they might even go overboard and, binge eat, that kind of thing. People also report that when they drink or they use, they have less of an appetite. So a lot of different kinds of pathways there. There are the substances that we talked about before, the stimulants that curb appetite. And so that's a pretty obvious interaction there.
And, we're not informed enough about that. Of course, in the beginning, I thought silver bullet. But I never thought what this does to my body and how much I'm running on an empty tank and that this is going to cost me later on because no one ever thought I would have back issues. I have a strong back, one would think. But it all gave out because I was running on overdrive on empty for so long, which, speed helps to exacerbate everything. Yeah, and then your body breaks down, but no one tells you that. You kind of think you found the silver bullet. You're not even aware of how hellishly high a price you will pay.
Yeah. Even for just, if someone comes in, for pure ADHD to a psychiatrist's office and they say, okay, here's your script for Adderall or Ritalin or Vyvanse, I feel like they should, be talking to them about how to continue to get their needs met throughout the day because, appetite might be reduced. And there are some strategies to deal with that, but I don't know how often that's addressed. And, there is a significant portion of people who use stimulants who will restrict, not even necessarily purposely during the day. They're just not hungry because they're on speed and then come home at the end of the day and overeat or binge eat,
Yeah, exactly.
Just more on that correlation, a lot of patients who have both of these disorders do have a trauma history. And you can think about, you can think about how, like, I say to my patients, like, life is challenging. When you have a traumatic history, it makes perfect sense that you would turn to anything you can to help you cope.
Self-medicate in some way.
Yeah, and these are just different ways of doing that.
That's what I believe. I think it's all about some deep source of emotional neglect, attachment trauma, stuff like that. I don't know. But I am totally with Gabor Mate on these matters, and he's really the one that I think has it down with addictions and the nature of addictions, and that we are all trying to self-medicate. He himself had it with classical music. He kind of almost ruined his marriage and his financial situation by compulsively buying really, really expensive classical music collections and stuff like that, which sounds ridiculous when you first hear it. But to me, it never did, because I think you can use everything to numb your pain. But oftentimes, people do not talk about pain. They either shame people for being, you're a drug addict, or people who have eating disorders and are kind of addicted to exercise. They are probably even going to be complimented because, wow, what a discipline. So there's different addictions and different treatments to the addiction from the outside world. So, of course, me knowing from my own mother who, used alcohol and pills and eventually committed suicide over a long period of time and was seriously disordered with eating, all I had in mind was, I don't want to end up like her. So for me, the demon was drugs. The demon was
Yeah.
alcohol. So all I had my focus on was these two. Avoid these two at all costs. And, you have to control your life because there's no one else out there related to you helping you. So
Yes.
get your grip together, and alcohol and drugs will not serve this. So I kind of developed this masculine approach and just, how do you call this? My bootstraps sort of thing? How's
Pull
the
yourself
saying?
up by your bootstraps.
Thank you. Pull myself
Yeah.
up by the bootstraps. So I was focusing on that. And out of my blind spot, all of my eating issues started
Yeah.
piling up. And I do not think that I am not better than anyone else. I could have easily had a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction or whatever. There was just some pain I needed to numb out from. And simply because I had my focus on alcohol and drugs so hard that it didn't happen. But something else happened. And so I think there's always something we need to take into consideration, the whole human being and the human being story, and where they were hurt or where they were met with neglect or unpredictability or unsafety or violence. Then of course this person will not know what to do when it all gets too much to bear.
Right. Think about it almost like a healthy adaptive response.
That just stops
to-
working over the years.
Yeah. I had this image as you were talking about trying to steer away from alcohol and drugs based on your family history of like a bucket full of water and, two holes that the bucket could have leaked out of. And you did like so much work in like patching up this one hole to make sure it didn't leak out of that one hole. But then it came pouring out of the other hole.
Exactly.
Even with more force,
And I wasn't aware of it. So, I've been to therapy, as I said, for, more than 20 years. And it was never on the radar. I didn't expect it. It just hit me. And I noticed way too late that this has been building up forever. And I wasn't aware of that leaking hole. And I was wondering why I was getting such a crappy gas mileage out of my life car and why stuff just didn't work out. So I would love to just be able to have conversations about this so that maybe someone else gets a light bulb moment. That's the goal I have with conversations like this, even though I do talk a bit much today, I notice. So you hardly get any airtime.
No, I like hearing your story, and I think that it's really beneficial for others to hear it too. I wanted to say one more thing about this link between addictions and eating disorders. We know that there's a genetic component to eating disorders, and more research is being done to kind of figure out what that looks like exactly. But a lot of times when I ask patients who have an eating disorder, do you have any family history of any eating disorders? A lot of times they'll say yes, obviously, but then sometimes someone will say no, but there will be, yes, my dad was an alcoholic or my grandmother had an addiction. So there oftentimes is that correlation. And I read a study maybe a year ago or so that showed that in trying to isolate some of these genes, they are finding an overlap in where these things are coming from genetically with eating disorders. And I think that study in particular was alcohol use disorders.
I wonder if it's not just that we kind of learn from our parents, and when we have an addicted parent or someone with an eating disorder, whatever it is, someone with a low self-esteem, basically, someone who is in pain, how are they not going to transfer their pain? How are we going to learn a better coping mechanism? So of course we're going to repeat it. So I kind of question the whole genetic thing, because we do what we learn to do. Our examples are people with diseases themselves. How are they going to teach us something else?
That's a good point. There's always, obviously a combination of nature and nurture, I also wanted to come back to your idea of exercise, and I'm trying to think of other things. I think, workaholism, there are kind of like addictive behaviors in our world where people are reinforced, oh, that's so great. Like you're running marathons. Oh, now you're doing triathlons and ultra marathons. Like that's fabulous. thing where it's really reinforced in the world. And I think the same thing with, working 12-hour days. And
yeah, you're right.
I'm trying to think of other things that might be on par, but I think it's sometimes harder. Restriction is another one, wow.
You've been so good.
You've been so good. Yeah. You haven't eaten any carbs this whole week. And I think it's even, more challenging to take a look at those addictive tendencies when everyone around you. Yeah, that's a great one. When everyone around you is saying like, hey, I want to be like that.
Exactly.
Or, that's so wonderful that you're able to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think beneath all of them is anxiety. It's always some sort of deep existential fear of not being enough. I think perfectionism is just another disguise for fear. It tells me that a person is afraid. Why else would you want everything to be perfect? It doesn't need to be perfect. Nature is not perfect. We are all just human beings. So there must be a fear there that drives you, that you think that if you don't do it perfectly, people will find out that you're not worthy of the love. So you better try harder.
Underneath it all, I'm not okay.
And I think it's the same for eating disorders. It's the same for, it's a deep pain. It's a fear that you're not enough.
Mm-hmm. You're making me think. I just got back. I do a lot of work with group therapy, and I just got back from a group psychotherapy conference where part of the training and the continuing education that I do is like I actually become a group member with other therapists, and we sit in the group for a couple of days straight. And I love it. And it's so nourishing, actually in terms of my work. One of the themes I think that comes up a lot in group, both part of my training and then in terms of the groups that I lead, is what is it like to make yourself vulnerable to other people, to expose yourself completely authentically, warts and all, and have someone still accept you. And if you can do that, that's everything.
Feel safe. Yeah. And I had to cut my losses. There are so many people from my media days that probably think she's gone psycho. And I totally I stand firm in my shoes on this, saying I'd rather have 10,000 whatever listeners instead of 1 million listeners that love me on the surface for something that is clearly a role. And I think this is really an issue, because as long as you think that you have to perform a role all the time, how are you going to talk about stuff that bothers you? And if everybody is just smiling their artificial smiles and performing their artificial happiness at you all day, how are you going to think you can talk about that stuff? When you keep thinking and it's being reinforced that you're probably the only one, when in fact, no, the opposite is true.
Right. I mean, I don't. Maybe I'm just projecting, but I imagine that the transition that you've made, that you have found more value in this kind of work.
It's a good question. I can only answer it with, I have found more internal safety. Still not enough, interestingly, but to know that what I'm doing is helping 10,000, 20,000 people per episode gives me a feeling that, Merit, it cannot be about your weight. This is not about you, your looks, your age, your weight. People appreciate this because it's honest and it's real, period. And then that gives me some safety, to talk back to my gremlin that goes, yeah, you better keep that weight in check or else. Or you better stay on that elliptical a little longer or else. And then I see the whole futility of it all. And that is just me, my inner little girl, trying to escape from the harm she was in. And that it's not necessary anymore. That I'm being appreciated for who I am, warts and all, as you said. And that is, everybody is aching to be accepted, warts and all. Everyone. Even Donald Trump, everyone wishes that they could finally let go of their mask and say, I do this and that. And then people would relate. I think that would be the cure for this whole world being everyone against each other instead of with each other, when there's so much more similar about people than there is differences.
One of the things that I like to ask my patients is, when hopefully you have a long, full life, and when you're looking back at the end of your life, on your life, what do you want to be able to say for yourself? What do you want to be known for? What do you want to have accomplished? And people will tell me, I want to have made an impact in the world. I want to have been a good daughter, wife, mother, friend. I want to have made maybe some strides in my career, or I want to have been a good person or a good friend, whatever they say. And it's funny that not one person in the course of my career thus far has ever said, I want to look back on my life and know that I was thin.
Mm-hmm. Do you realize that this is the final question of my podcast always?
Oh, is it?
Yeah. And it's exactly for that kind of reason. Because when I picture in my head my tombstone saying she was a great dieter and she was super fit, then it gets ridiculous. Like, then certainly if there was a God, they'd have to send me back and say, no, you kind of didn't get the point here.
But no one says that. No one really, in their heart of hearts, at their core, wants that to be her legacy. And yet she lives many of her waking moments with that in mind. And so one of the things that I think is helpful is to point out that discrepancy. It's kind of like a values exercise. Isn't it interesting that you're telling me you value family and love and connection and ambition and authenticity, whatever it is, all these things, and yet you spend 90% of your waking time thinking about calories and your body? What do you do with that discrepancy?
Mm-hmm. And what happens when you point that out to your clients?
It seems, I'm not saying it's like, oh, I'm cured, but it seems to resonate. Like it seems to hit a nerve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It relates back to the one of the exercises in your book where you ask, what might you accomplish if you weren't fixated on body weight and appearance?
Yeah.
And that kind of gets us thinking how much time and brain space is being or has been wasted for so long. And what could we have done instead? Speaking of women's oppression, I mean, we keep on oppressing ourselves. We are contributing to our own oppression. Instead of going out and doing wonderful things and maybe bettering the world, we are really all just focusing on how we look, and we are talking to each other about that and finding camaraderie in diet talk, which is, when you think about it, it's tragic.
It is tragic.
It's nothing short of tragic.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to blame women for, like, I use the word brainwashing. And I really believe, I don't think that's too strong of a word. I think we're brainwashed to think and feel this way. But then I think we can do a lot to like reverse this brainwashing. It does take a lot of effort though, to, like I said before, to be swimming upstream. I remember one time I was giving an interview with a reporter and I talked about, like, gosh, it's something women, when we get together, like we talk so much about food and weight and bodies and all that kind of stuff. And it's so unfortunate. And she said, well, do you have any other ideas about what women can talk about? And I was like, wow, I mean, anything, everything, you know, like, and even that question struck me that, like,
yeah, it's an interesting question.
Right?
Whoa, what do you mean?
Like, I feel like I don't even know how to answer that. Like anything but this, which is really such a sliver of what is.
Do you think women don't realize that they really know a lot more than about calories and weight and exercise?
I think it's sort of like on your camera, like you don't know that you've zoomed in, you know what I mean? And you have to realize, like, wow, I have to zoom out and then I can see everything else that's around me.
Beautifully put. Yeah. We are zoomed in too much, and we probably don't even realize how much we are capable of when we do zoom out. There's so much stuff that is interesting, and every person has their different stuff they're interested in.
Right.
And they will probably also find it nourishing to be allowed to finally be interested in the stuff that is not related to body and weight and food and exercise.
Right. And such a good choice of words, nourishing.
Yeah. You have a degree in exercise science as well. And I would think that you get a lot of women who think they are recovering from one or the other eating disorder, and then they are just substituting everything with exercise. So whether you make someone stop vomiting and then they just start over-exercising, or you make an anorexic eat and she just starts over-exercising. And that part of the story is often not discussed at all because, again, as you said, it's one of the addictions that gets underestimated or even laughed at with something like, I mean, I heard many times, oh, I wish I had your addiction. That's a cool addiction. I'm like, thank you for not respecting any of my feelings or not even asking how this actually feels like. Yeah. And that's why I'm really happy that we can talk about that. Yeah. My guess is that you see this a lot of times in your practice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yes, I got a master's degree in exercise science before moving on to clinical psychology, but for someone who eats and then needs to somehow compensate for eating through purging or laxatives, and then maybe eventually gets to the point where that becomes exercise, I don't see that as progress. It's all compensation. And I think that the goal is to not feeling like we need to compensate for what we're eating. I think exercise is a great part of life if we can use it in a healthy way. You know, if we can be focusing on like, wow, this makes me feel good. This is good for my physical and mental health. But it can also, as you know, be used quite destructively.
Yeah, and how are we going to be aware of that when we are steeped in a culture that goes go hard or go home and workouts that are called insanity and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, boot camp style, women are somehow acting as if they were males. And we are believing, I did believe it as well, like we are being taught how to do this, how to suppress your hunger, how to go longer without eating, how to crank up your exercise and make it a daily habit because then you are, you know, we are being taught this. We are being taught a disordered behavior at literally almost every corner. So how can we, you know, even make room for another conversation?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think that we have a fitness industry that supports disorder. I do a lot of talking and writing about that. And I actually still work within that industry for, I guess, 20 years now. I've been certified as a personal trainer, and I've been teaching fitness classes on and off throughout those 20 years. And I try to teach a very different kind of fitness class than what I see out there. When I take classes, nothing makes me more frustrated and upset when they talk about like who burnt the most calories, raise your hand. Or, you know, around the holidays, it comes out a lot, you know, like, oh, we got to get rid of last night's Thanksgiving meal. And every time that happens, I go up to the instructor after and have a conversation, and it's tiring. So I right now teach a class where I try to make it a little bit more mind body. I, have my students set an intention before class. I always read a kind of like an inspirational quote. I do a lot of saying, here's an option. Listen to your body right now and choose what feels right for you. And I don't think we get a lot of that in the fitness industry. I think we get a lot of like do or die, no pain, no gain, that kind of thing.
Exactly. How did it develop in the past 20 years from your viewpoint as being in it?
Well, so like I said, I got this master's degree in exercise science. My thesis was on the effects of exercise on mood. And I really believe that exercise can be a mood enhancer. Unless, of course, you're using it to attack yourself and then it doesn't feel so good. And then once I started studying psychology and then focusing on eating disorders and body image, I thought, let me figure out a way to integrate these things, because I don't necessarily think that we need to be so black and white and say, okay, exercise is problematic in this world and we need to cast it aside. I think we can find a way to integrate it and work with people on intuitive movement and doing what feels right for them. You know, I write in my book, I just said, let's not be so black and white. I'm pretty black and white on this one issue. Like, is this behavior self-care or self-attack?
Both.
And I think maybe, but like, I think if you're going for a run and you're doing that because it feels good and you like the way you feel when you're doing it, or you like the way you feel after, and you know that it's good for your health, to me, that feels like self-care. If you're doing it because you have to do it a certain amount of days a week, you're doing it
length or intensity.
Yeah, certain length, and you like have all these like rigid expectations of yourself. if you are not feeling so well that day, if you're tired, if, you know what I mean? Like for whatever reason, that it becomes self-attack. And I think that with practice, you can get good at figuring out what the motivation is.
Yeah. I read in a group that one woman said that she for ages had thought that, you cannot do a workout that is not 60 minutes. It has to be 60 minutes. And then she said, today I had a huge victory. I went into the gym. And after 10 minutes, I left because my body wasn't feeling it. And I was actually so proud of reading that because I know the tremendous strength it takes. I can only speak for myself because I tell myself, well, today, 10 minutes would be okay. But in reality, after 10 minutes, I go like, yeah, why not 5 more? And then, pile stuff up. And in the end, nothing you do that is less than you did whatever the week before is not worth anything.
Is sufficient. Yeah.
So how do we let go of the compulsive approach, or how do you help your clients?
I think that, is it hard to let go of it? Absolutely. And if you start to do that, like if you say, okay, my body's feeling tired right now, I want to respect it, take care of it, and so I'm going to leave after 20 minutes. Is anxiety going to creep up? Of course. But I think it's just like, it's like exposure therapy because you're not doing what like you quote unquote should be doing.
I
right?
see.
Like,
I want to ask the deeper question. Why anxiety? Why does this make us anxious? Is this the old pain that comes up as soon as we are not coping with it? Or?
I think 2 things. It could be the old pain and, you're not engaging in the coping mechanism that you usually use. And then it also could be that you have this like new expectation of yourself. I have to do 60 minutes and anything that falls short of that is a failure. And that doesn't feel so good. Failure in quotes, right? Because it's not really. And the reality is that if you could get yourself to go, you being generic you, to the gym for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, that's actually more of a success, right? Than staying the whole time.
Yeah, it's perceived by the brain or by us or in our minds as a potential threat to our safety. Because this anxiety can be so gripping and it feels like guilt and anxiety and fear at the same time for me. And I think that there must be some deep stuff because if like with all of my friends, if I tell them today you're going to have to stay on the couch, they'd go like, oh yeah, great. Hand me the popcorn. Let's watch a movie. And I get fidgety quite quickly as in trying to be perfect and not being discovered as being a fake or being a fluke or being not enough. I think that's the root of the anxiety that you were talking about.
I think that just because we have anxiety doesn't mean we can't survive. You know what I mean? Like it's uncomfortable, but it will dissipate over time. Okay. I also think that it might be workable if it's approached in stages. If you usually go for 60 minutes, can you try going for 55 one day and see what that brings up for you? And it has to be done with this sort of like, I'm not here to torture myself. I'm really here to better myself. This whole cutting back thing, Yeah.
I see so many women telling me or writing to me that they can't do it. It's just, I can't reduce it. I reduce it for 2 days and then I go back. Seems to be the last frontier. I heard the expression so many times that women tell me, this is the last frontier for me. I cannot let go. So that's where I get the idea from that there must be a lot of pain under this. Otherwise, we just chill the hell out.
And then, like you said, that I think that people sometimes are forced into situations where they have injuries or, a lot of times people who are over exercising do develop like overuse syndromes and sometimes they'll keep going through it. I've seen patients who have done that who tell me that they have fractures and they're continuing to exercise. And sometimes people will sort of use it as like a wake up moment of like, all right, I can't anymore. And if I want to be able to do this for the long haul, like engage in what should be a healthy behavior for the rest of my life, I'm going to have to dial it back a little bit.
Okay. And then you help them with the anxiety that comes up.
Yeah. I wonder the people that you're talking about that are trying to cut back but can't, are they working with a therapist on this, or are they trying to do it on their own?
This I don't know.
Do you know?
Because I'm not a therapist, and I do this only on the side, but I have a big group on Facebook, and people write their stuff, and I cannot respond or, analyze all of that, but I see a common theme is that they can start eating more or feeding themselves better according to what they really want, and then suddenly the exercise becomes a real problem. Talking about addiction transfer, you know what I mean?
In higher levels of care, they'll just recommend taking a break from the exercise behavior as it is for a period of time until it can be reintegrated in a healthier way.
Do you think that's easier for people to do? Not initially, but do you think that's a more effective approach?
It might be easier than trying to do it on their own. Do you know what I mean? And cutting back, it might be easier for people, especially who are a little bit more rigid in their thinking, to just say, all right, it's off the table for now, except maybe, in my treatment center, they'll allow me to do, slow walking or something like that. Sometimes it is easier to make a change when someone else is making you make that change, and you don't feel like, oh, I'm a quote unquote failure. I'm personally responsible for not engaging in this behavior that I'm supposed to be doing.
Same goes for saying no to diet culture and its toxic messages. It's so much easier when you have a group of women, even if it's only online, but you're kind of seeing through the BS and you're trying to recover from it, because you can't do it alone. You go out of your house and you relapse into diet culture or diet mentality in 2 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I want to know, you have a lot of stuff on, shocking numbers that kind of shake us awake into what is going on. The many messages you get about people's fear of becoming fat, and stuff on becoming a critical consumer in this diet culture world. Would you care and give us some examples? Because I think this is useful.
In terms of becoming a critical consumer, I think it's really helpful to look at the media that we're exposed to and sort of deconstruct it. Instead of just absorbing it, we're looking at it more analytically. And I do that in the book. I do that in the blog that inspired this book. I present whether it's television commercials or print ads and kind of break them down and look at some of the messages that we're getting from them. I talk a lot in the book about language and how that impacts how, diet culture, how we think about our bodies, ourselves, that kind of thing.
Can you make an example?
Phrases like, she got her body back after she had a baby. What does that even mean? Where did it go?
Are we supposed to get our own teenage body back and toddler body back? This is so absurd.
We have so many sayings that you don't even realize, we don't think about, because they're just so much a part of the vernacular. But it's helpful to step back and actually, like I said, look at them critically. Jokes about eating disorders, I think, are really common. I know you said people have said to you, I wish I had your discipline, or with, the exercise, that kind of thing.
Or even when I said I have a problem with this being an addiction for me, this is related to a lot of fear for me. And they said, oh God, I wish I had your addiction.
Yeah. I mean, when I was writing this book, I would encounter people, I'd be in a coffee shop writing a book, or, I remember one time going to a medical doctor and him saying, what do you specialize in? My own medical doctor, and me saying eating disorders. And I can't even tell you how many conversations I've had like this where people say, oh, I wish I had an eating disorder.
Yes, I heard that on a podcast of a big comedian as well, who said, I wish I was anorexic.
Yeah. It's so upsetting every time I hear that. I mean, my just sort of gut response is, no, you don't, which is what I say to people. And then I have to go into a whole spiel about how tormenting an eating disorder is. But I think that the more sort of awakened we are to how language is used in our culture, the advertising industry, all those kinds of things, I think the more aware we can be about how these factors are influencing us.
Yeah, and it's important to become critical, because the messages are being, subtly packaged into something we are maybe tempted to believe.
Right.
Can you remember some of the numbers you crunch in your book off the top of your head? Like, I remember that it was more than half of the population would rather be hit by a truck than be fat. You quoted that, and then you said, but still, we don't think we have a problem. What a good point. Like, how can we make a statement like that? It's true. There have been studies. More than half of the population. How can we still say we do not have a problem?
Right.
Yeah.
Or there was something in the book, I mean, it was a while ago now since I wrote it, about how women we'd rather be anything else but fat.
Yeah.
Any other, what we perceive to be like a negative term, the IQ drop.
25% of women apparently indicated that they would sacrifice 20 IQ points for the, quote, perfect body. And when you really translate this into straight language, a quarter of women would rather potentially drop to an IQ level just above borderline intellectual functioning than settle for a less than perfect body.
Yeah.
That alone.
That's astounding,
tells you,
right?
Yeah. This is so alarming. You had another example, I think, that people, especially women, an alarming percentage of women are willing to be sick with a painful, potentially dangerous virus just to lose the weight.
To lose weight. Yeah, that came up in, I started writing my blog in 2006, which I can't believe it's been in existence for over 10 years. And, in the earlier stages, not so much now, but in the earlier stages, I had a pretty active community, kind of like your Facebook group, where people would comment a lot on the posts and there was a lot of dialogue. And I remember I posted one time on something like that. And, a lot of people were identifying with that and saying, I secretly hope for a stomach bug.
That pains me even to hear that. And you wrote about asking women the question, would you rather be thin or happy? Apparently got you answers like, well, what's the difference?
What's the difference?
So there truly is this deep-seated belief that thin equals happy.
Yep. And I actually remember one of the women that I asked that, actually another mental health professional.
Whoa.
That's I mean, we're not immune from this by any stretch. And there are certainly a number of professionals who specialize in eating disorders who either have or have had their own struggles. So, it's like, why wouldn't happy be above thin? Even if we're recognizing that, there is this thin ideal in our culture today.
Yeah, and so many women are thin but very unhappy because they are busy trying to be thin and chasing happiness and not finding it and not really getting why it's not there.
Yep, that's right.
It's so sad. How do people find you? Would you share your contact details with us?
Sure. So I have a website. It's called Gatewell, GATEWELL, therapycenter.com.
All right. So that would be for people who live in the area of Miami, I think?
Yeah, I'm based in Miami, but in the States. I'm also licensed to practice in 2 other states, California and New York. And so I do a lot of video and phone counseling in these 3 states.
Good to know. And now there is my final question. You kind of brought it up before already, and now it's being asked of you. What would you like to be remembered for?
I think one of my most important values is to be an authentic person. Authenticity is such an important thing for me.
Yeah, and it's important for other people to see your authenticity because that is giving others the courage to be authentic as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a good mom and role model to my children, but just in terms of the legacy that I leave, I find a lot of meaning in my clinical work. And if I can be a vulnerable, authentic, confident person, I'll feel that I sort of did my job.
Wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Stacey.
Me too, of course.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome, make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.